Good morning. Welcome to Wood's Showcase presentations. Typically, these are for highlighting the next fancy this or that within the industry. Today, I want to take a different path and have a good old front porch conversation. The showcase is divided into 3 presentations, which are all centered around building a flood risk tool. Now, before you jump ahead in the wrong direction, the tool I'm talking about is the collective sets of flood risk data, both regulatory and non-regulatory, that individuals and communities could, should, and will have access in the near future to manage their flood risk. As a part of building this tool, we're going to discuss data and parameter development. Now, one thing I want to get straight right from the beginning, flood risk management is a marathon, not a sprint. Just like the stages of a marathon, where you have stages of the fast runners at the beginning and the slower runners at the back, flood risk management varies by community. So let's sit down on front porch and have a conversation about building a tool for flood risk management, specifically data and parameter development. I think it's important for us to agree on a few things before we start. As engineers and analysts, we all like to have formulas. So let's see if we can agree that better data plus better models plus better communications equal reduced loss of life, reduced property damage, and increases the probability of implementable flood reduction solutions. We're building a tool that's kind of like an adjustable wrench or a crescent wrench. It's adjustable for each community's marathon stage, but it needs to take into all types of flood risk, whether it be riverine, pluvial, lake, coastal, sinkholes, playas, fluvial fans. It needs to be all-encompassing, but it needs to be scalable based on a community needs. So why does flood risk management matter? Because water sometimes does this. Now, each of you may not have had this happen in your house or your home or someone you know or in your community, but you have seen this in some scale or another within your community. We need to be able to assess, predict, and communicate its behavior. Risk education and management are crucial if we're ever going to develop a risk management tool that's used and reduces the loss of life and damages to assets. Let's agree that we're going to have a data-driven flood risk process. But we need to remember that flood risks are just a snapshot in time. Once that snapshot is taken, the accuracy depreciates immediately. Some possible accuracy depreciation issues that will produce high depreciation would be urbanized areas with high growth and redevelopment, watersheds that experience one or more recent floods of records, and large areas of wildfire or other land use characterization changes. Living models are the best path forward. And what I mean by a living model is a model that we're going to start building here, and the basic frame of the model will last for now on. The parameters will be developed to a level of detail to where new data can be slid in. The models can be updated with minimal changes, and you can have updated flood risk assessments associated with that new data and the changes that have occurred since the original snapshot in time and the new data. We need to especially pay attention in our BLE models that we are producing models that are not going to change drastically just because we need to come back at a later time and produce a detailed study. That means that we need to be visionary and think about where the community or where the river needs to have detailed computations on it in the future. If you'll step back and look at the big picture, typically those locations will pop off of the maps to you, and you can plan accordingly. I think it's important for us to realize that no community is too small. All assets and lives matter, rural or urban. Many times rural lives are at more risk because they do not have the staff or the whole departments that do stormwater or floodplain management. So having good flood risk data sets could be the difference between them making the right and the wrong decisions associated with managing a flood event. Better data typically includes topography, land use, rainfall statistics, gauge data. It might be more gauges, it might be just longer records of gauges. Better base maps, better transportation line work, and better data associated with transportation databases from the various agencies. All of this is reflecting as being better than it would have been associated with the same data used on the effective maps that could be 10, 20, or 30 years old. Let's talk just a little bit about base maps. Base maps is that data that we put behind the flood risk so that you or anyone else can figure out where you are in reference to that flood risk. It gives you landmarks. It could be associated with the aerials, associated with the NAIPS or the national map. It might be roadways or roadway intersections, or it could be political boundaries. All of these pulled together as a part of the base map information to help you identify where that flood risk is in reference to other things. Topography, topography, topography. It is the foundation of good flood risk data analysis. Now, what's on the screen now? There's a growing population of people that do flood risk data analysis that wouldn't even recognize what's here. They've never used a quad map, or they've never used 7.5 minute quads. They've never used the 10-meter DIMS to do flood risk. They've been spoiled by more detailed topography. We are very fortunate that we have flood risk data sets being developed today using LIDAR, light detection and ranging data. The old data would have had 5 to 20 foot contours, where new data is 6-inch to 2-foot contours. Just a reminder that all LIDAR sets are not created equal. They are collected from the air. They are a function of the LIDAR pulse's ability to get through the canopy. That's one of the reasons why sometimes our stream banks aren't as defined as we would like them, because of the dense canopy along one bank or both banks of the stream. But I can truly say that this LIDAR data is by far better than the DIMS and the 10-meter DIMS and the USGS quads that we looked at on the previous page. The USGS has done a tremendous job of standardizing these data sets, and now no matter where you go to do flood risk data computations, you can count on the quality and the consistency of the data. The typical LIDAR sets is the USGS QL2 data. It's ground truth with survey points through a QA/QC process. They create the bare earth, which is represented in the graphic to the right. One thing I want to call out, and we'll come back to this at a later point in the presentation, is that it can only see what the points bounce off of. So openings through berms, openings through dams, and openings through roadways, it cannot pick up. As we move into flood risk data management on a structure basis, it's going to be more and more important to have good footprints associated with those structures. Extracting that information as a derivative from the LIDAR data sets is a very achievable process in today's technology. This is just a good example showing good imagery, LAS points, and the production of good footprint coverage within a community. In today's 2D modeling, having just the footprint is not enough. We need the third dimension. We need that height of the building so that those buildings can be put into the 2D models for obstructions. As shown here, density and size of footprints can vary drastically across a community, whether you're in the wide floodplain or out of the floodplain on the hills. One of the key components is a good digital stream network. We need a topographically correct stream network. With the new LiDAR data and the detail of the LiDAR data, these good digital stream networks are much easier to do now than they were as of maybe even 5 years ago. This is just an example to show how detailed hydro-enforced streams we can produce. This is the effective streams associated with the special flood hazard areas for this watershed. But then we could go up to the 40-acre drainage, or the 10-acre, or the 1-acre. We can do this to the extents well beyond what we could ever imagined a few years ago. And these stream networks and these drainage characteristics associated with those 1-acre basins can help with floodplain management and erosion control associated with development in these areas. The green lines here are from the 40-acre line up to the 10-acre contribution line. The yellow are from the 40 to the 160, and the orange are from the effective areas up to the 160. As you can see, it varies depending on the shape and the slope of the watershed. We define conveyance paths up to 40 acres in urban areas like this. And then we rely on a refined, detailed mesh to do the pluvial flooding associated with the green segments. As we complete this part of our conversation, we now have the foundation complete. We have better topography, bathymetry, stream center lines, and conveyance paths. Always build your data sets for easy updates in future marathons. Now that we've got our foundation established, we're going to hop into hydrology, part 1. Where does the water go when it rains? It lands. Then does it go in the ground? Does it hang out in the trees and the bushes? Does it puddle here? Does it pond there? Does it run down the roof to the gutters, to the driveway, to the street, to the pipe, to the ditch, to the creek? Just where does the water go? Hydrology, part 2. How fast does the raindrop travel when it's leaving its landing area? How fast does it go? It varies. Might be on a gently sloped grass area and kind of takes its time leaving. Could be on a steep metal roof and it flies off. Could be on a flat parking lot. Could be on a steep parking lot. Could be on a flat road, a steep road. Could be out in a cornfield. Could land on a lake. Could land in the woods. Could land in the blackberry patch. Could land on a steep mountainside. Land on the trees on a steep mountainside. Timing of the rainfall runoff. That is an important part. Infiltration is the initial piece of determining the volume of the runoff. It's very important for us to determine how many raindrops do not venture from their landing area. One of the most important parameters associated with that is the soil that the raindrop lands on in its landing area. Typically in hydrology, we're looking for 4 hydrologic soil groups, A, B, C, and D. A being a very sandy soil, D being a very clayey, non-permeable soil. All soils across the U.S. and across our areas that we'd be studying have a classification. Sometimes they have a split classification, might be B/C or C/D. In those cases, it's important to look at what the characteristics are that give it that split characterization and try to determine which of those is most appropriate within your watershed. The Surgo data set is our go-to source for these soil classifications. It also is important to know that the NRCS is in the process of updating some places. So you need to go check on a regular basis to make sure those areas within your watershed have not been updated. Land use is a very important characteristic also and the parameter to define well. Because if you've got sandy soils but you got a parking lot built on it, guess what? That landing pad is going to prevent that raindrop from entering the soil. So it's important to have good land use designations. Also in the 2D world, land use also associated with the roughness coefficients for runoff. So a process that we've been applying to our detailed studies is particular and associated with our urbanized areas, and we've been doing image analysis associated with land cover classifications. Just requires moderate high resolution imagery, 4-band multispectral imagery, and then follow the process. There are various ways to QA/QC your cover classification. There are other data sets out there that you can use to verify/calibrate your cover classification. And you should do this for any of those that are easily accessible. This has to be part of flood risk data analysis because look at all the different knobs you can twist to do your land cover classification. Now we can start seeing the level of detail associated with the land cover classifications come through in the graphic on the right. You should note here that we've now incorporated the cropland data from the USDA database. The brown here is the cropland added. You should note also that this cropland data sets are updated yearly by the USDA, and they're very valuable in your rural portions of your watershed analysis. And last but not least, just a comparison of the NAIT classification versus the national land use. You can tell that the level of detail is much more, and depending on what level of mesh you use to define your 2D models, the detail of the land use could be very influential, especially associated with applying overland flow Manning's values in the headwaters on your mesh system. The third leg on this stool to go along with soils and land use would be the slope of the ground. You could have very porous soils, but if it's on very steep terrain, the landing area might be such that the raindrop just can't hang out there long enough to infiltrate. So slope is a very vital component associated with the timing of rainwater runoff. Now we need to calculate our curve numbers associated with our standard SCS methodology. We now have our soil, hydrologic soil groups. We have our land use down the left column here. And as you can see, for a given land use, say deciduous forest, look at that range, 30 to 77, a factor of 2 depending on whether it's a sandy soil or a non-permeable soil. So hydrologic soil group matters. It's important if you're trying to do accurate flood risk to determine which ones of those categories apply, because even on the deciduous forest, the difference between a B and a C is 55 and 70. So if it's B/C, it's important for you to determine whether C is most applicable for your watershed or B is most applicable. When you look at this curve number distribution, you can see how important it is. As you see those darker colors, which is 98, your mesh cell there, water is going to run off almost instantly. As compared to the softer colors, the yellow and the orange, they're going to hang out for a little while because those soils have permeability. And whoa, Nelly, what a difference RAS 6 is from RAS 5. We've been developing 2D models for the last 4 years, since 2016 funding for CTPs. And in doing that, we have been using average curve numbers across whole watersheds. RAS 6 truly allows us to do spatial varying curve numbers, spatial varying rainfall. And in doing that, you can see the level of detail so that the actual water flowing down the streams can be more or less based on the contributions at a given point, as opposed to averaged over the whole basin. One of the things we noticed in doing the RAS6 updates on many of our models is that on the larger streams, when you get to 10 to 15 square miles or more drainage area, there wasn't a whole lot of differences in the RAS6 flows versus the RAS5 flows. But in the headwaters, especially in the urbanized areas or the areas where the land use changes or the soil characteristic changes, we've seen 30, 40, or 50% difference in those flows. Let's talk a little bit about the RAS6 and the volumes of the runoff. As we talked about on the previous slide, the volume of runoff is important. The volume of runoff and being able to detail that curve number for the volume of runoff on a given part of a ditch or a small conveyance way, especially in the pluvial flooding areas, is going to be very important as we move forward. One of the things that always bothered me associated with our RAS5 models was that because you're averaging that excess rain on grid across the whole watershed, one could actually go in, take in a 100 square mile watershed, take a quarter section, 160 acres of farmland that was corn, change it to half-acre residential housing, and not even move the needle associated with that excess rainfall value that we're applying across the whole 100 square miles. So think about that. You could actually change the land use on 160 acres in a local community and use the FEMA model to show that you're not causing an impact. That's a problem. I am so glad that RAS6 now provides us the technology and the opportunity to circumvent those problems. Good data is very important in building a tool. Science-driven solutions is very important, especially if you have the breakthroughs in technology to provide you to apply the science in a meaningful way. It's very important to have good volume and timing of rainfall runoff. One of the things that you've noted is we're not doing here, we haven't done any time of concentration calculations like we normally would have associated with a detailed HMS or other detailed rainfall runoff computations. As part of that, one of the things that we have been doing associated with our hydrology is we've been applying overland flow Manning's values in the headwaters to try to account for that timing of the slow runoff at the beginning of the conveyance paths as those raindrops initially leave their landing areas. And we've seen some very good results associated with applying that in several different watersheds. We want to make sure that when we build this tool, we use better data, and we do it in a way that the depreciation schedule does not depreciate too much, but when it does depreciate enough that it needs to be updated, you can basically slide one of these data sets that we've been talking about in and update the model and get new flood risk data development easily. Whatever we do, we owe it to the profession to not create these models in a way that it's a redo. Give us an upgrade, please. That should be our goal. Building tomorrow's tool today is the most strategic return on investment. Building a tool today that can be easily updated tomorrow is important. The only true thing in the flood risk world is change. Just when you think you've got Mother Nature figured out, she'll change direction and come in from another direction and come in with a different strategy. It's important for us to have a strategic return on our investments so that we can move with the flow associated with the changes that are coming our way in the industry. I want to thank you for joining me for this front porch conversation, Building a Tool for Flood Risk Management, Part 1, Data and Parameter Development. If there's anything associated with this presentation that you'd like to have a front porch conversation, don't hesitate to reach out to me. My email address is here on the slide. It's Stephen with a PH .no@woodplc.com, and we'll have a good old discussion. Thank you. All righty. I just wanted to open up for a few questions here following the part one part of our front porch conversation, if anyone has any. And we've got two other presentations going on following this, a part two and a part three, and we won't be limited to just questions in the part two or part three. If there's something that comes up associated with the part one during the others, we can feel free to answer those questions during those question answer sessions also. So that's one good thing about a front porch conversation is hopefully we talk about things in a level of detail to where it is understandable and it is more of a conversation than a workshop or a technical class. That's the goal of a front porch conversation. Did have a question here associated with calibration issues. Currently, and we'll get into this in the part two session here that'll follow here shortly, but probably the biggest issue we're seeing in calibration issues right now is when we get down into the very bottom ends of very large streams. We're having difficulties matching volumes and sometimes having to push calibration techniques like aerial adjustment beyond the standards in order to calibrate. I think that's a industry-wide type issue that we're experiencing associated with calibration with rain on grid models. But there's a lot of smart people at Wood as well as with other consultants that are collaborating on good standardized standard of the industry methods to address that calibration. Got a question here associated with how far does RAS 6 go back? Well, RAS 6 was actually released beta in December. We're really hoping that RAS 6 final is issued here within a couple of weeks. RAS 5 goes back 4 years ago, which was the introduction of 2D in RAS. We're finding out there were some questions on cost here, and I'll just throw out on a BLE level. If you do a really good BLE level study that's comparable to it's comparable to the costing associated with former Zone A studies. Very doable for those kind of costs, depending on where you are across the U.S. Got a question here about what creative methods are we using to communicate to provide input and data source information. Probably we're using ArcGIS Online project specific sites from the very beginning of our projects all the way through effective mapping if we go down the regulatory path. And that information, as well as having drop boxes for communities to drop big data sets to us, is found to be very, very, very useful. I will say it's very rewarding to me to go into these rural areas and have these county commissioners that are anti-computer, still have flip phones, aren't going to do anything associated with anything with technology. You throw an iPad out in front of them or in front of them with the website on it, and you start letting them tap it and move around, and you let them see the floodplains on their farm or out near their area that they grew up in, and you see them just start to glow. Now, they're not going to enter data. They're probably going to sit down with their county clerk and tell them what to do, but you've got them hook, line, and sinker into the process from that point forward. So I'd say our ArcGIS Online is our best way to communicate, getting comments in and out through the process. And with that, not seeing any other questions, I would say let's conclude this Q&A session associated with part one so that we can roll into part two here shortly and on time. And then we'll have a Q&A session for part two after it. Thank y'all. Welcome to Wood's Showcase Presentations. Typically, these are for highlighting the next fancy this or that within the industry. Today, I want to take a different path and have a good old front porch conversation. The showcase is divided into 3 presentations which are centered around building a flood risk tool. Now wait a minute, before you jump ahead in the wrong direction, the tool I'm talking about is a collective set of flood risk data, both regulatory and non-regulatory, that individuals and communities could, would, and will have access to in the near future to manage flood risk. We had a good old conversation, part 1, associated with data and parameter development. This conversation is associated with part 2, modeling. Why 2D modeling for building the flood risk tool? I guess a bigger question or a harder question to answer is why not? The two-dimensional modeling has revolutionized the industry. It has become the industry standard, especially with the Corps' release of 2D HEC-RAS. There's been advancements in computer technology and data accuracy, all making for the perfect storm to roll into 2D modeling flood risk data sets. It gives you a much better possibility of accurately designating and modeling actual flow paths, split flows, storage, where it occurs and where it doesn't, the depths of flooding and the depths of flows over given areas. Graphics is greatly improved associated with the 2D models. You can accurately create models in a lot of varying complex conditions. Because believe it or not, water does not always travel directly downstream. I tell a lot of people that they got social water and they get aggravated with me. Some of them get even red-faced. But then I explain to them they got social water because when it gets out of bank, it goes and visits everybody. And not only in that visitation day of going and visiting everybody, it doesn't always travel the direct path. Many times it's like Dennis the Menace, and it's over here and down there, and then it takes a left and it takes a right, and it might even circle back before it gets to the point downstream where our old 1D models would have said it went straight to. So, why 2D modeling? Because it gives us the best chance to create a living model that will change easily as better data sets down the road come available. This is a table that shows the benefits of 2D versus 1D. The original version of this was by Scott Hogan. As you note, all of you that might have an old timer somewhere that's told you what assume does to you and me. But as you can see in the 1D world, there are a lot of things that are assumed. It takes an objective opinion in order to, or an objective judgment in order to define, where in the 2D world they're computed. Well, when you go to do updates, you've got to go back through that objective reasoning in order to adjust each one of those locations and each one of those parameters, where in the 2D world, you slide the new data in, apply the new science, and you have an updated model. As we jump into model development mode here, one of the things I want to talk about on the two-dimensional parameters side is hydroconnections. Hydroconnections could be dams, berms, roads, railroads. It's basically anywhere that a culvert, a bridge, or an opening provides a path for water to be conveyed through raised ground or a man-made feature in the digital LiDAR. For you that were part of the earlier front porch conversation this morning, you might remember me pointing out that LiDAR collection cannot see below the ground. It can't see under the pavement or under the berms to see those pipes and those connections that convey water from one side or the other. These digital hydroconnectors provide that conveyance from point A to point B through these raised obstructions. Key components associated with doing good hydroconnectors is identifying their locations, determining their size that they are, or estimating their size, and then providing a cut through those raised areas with a virtual backhoe. The minimum width is 3 feet at the bottom, 6 feet at the top, 1 cell width at the bottom, and 3 cell widths or 2 cell widths at the top. You should note in this example of hydroconnectors, there's one to the right which has already been removed associated with the LiDAR data sets on the large bridge, but these other connectors, we've got to put a hydroconnector in order to allow the water to flow from one side of the road to the other. In order to do that, we bring in our virtual backhoe and burn that hydroconnector in to allow the water to flow from upstream to downstream so we don't over account for the storage upstream and or over predict the flood elevations associated with the upstream of that hydroconnector. All hydroconnectors are not created equal. As you can note, this bridge is a hydroconnector location, but that bridge is put in as a detailed study. So it needs not a hydroconnector by our typical. All the trapezoidal hydroconnectors are not equal. They can vary based on the width and the height of the road associated with that trapezoidal cut. So one of the things we try to do associated with our hydroconnectors is simulate the conveyance of the culvert with the trapezoid. We adjust the Manning's values associated with the trapezoid to simulate the design frequency for that roadway crossing. So this is a scenario, culvert under the road. LiDAR couldn't see it. So we have this berm and this embankment that represents the road and a culvert that goes under it. Now we bring in our virtual backhoe and we dig out that trapezoidal channel associated with this culvert crossing. And this is the minimum. See, it's 1 cell wide at the bottom, 3 cells wide at the top. As you can see, that trapezoidal area through that roadway crossing is much more than the area of that culvert. Now let's assume this road is a county road and all of the culverts and crossings across this road had a 10-year design level of service. So we take the estimated 10-year flow and then we back calculate what does the Manning's value need to be associated with that trapezoidal channel in order to put the water surface elevation at the top of the road. So thus we're increasing the Manning's value on these trapezoidal channels to simulate the restriction or the flow that would go through the culvert. Now this scenario is a 100-year design event. This might be an interstate or a major 4-lane thoroughfare. As you can see, the Manning's values for it and the spikes are very short in order to push the 100-year through that same opening and just reach the top of the road. If you know that the design criteria is to keep the 100-year 2 feet below the roadway, you can set that roadway elevation minus 2 feet and that Manning's value would be adjusted accordingly. All this process is to help simulate those hydroconnectors in all of those different connections way up into the watershed that helps design the travel and the flow and the timing of water to get to your special flood hazard area. In today's discussion, we talked about hydroconnectors first, but typically break lines are probably defined first and then hydroconnectors. Break lines are basically a line along the high points of railroads, levees, ag berms, dams, roads of all types. Any of those places to where there's enough of an obstruction and enough of an embankment to divert enough flow to make a difference in the flood risk data calculations. It should be noted that a lot of times you have multiple models linked together across a Huck 8 where one flows into another, flows into another. Getting the right number of hydroconnectors and break lines is really critical in order to have the right travel times through the watershed. That's kind of simulated here by the white line and the orange line as to the differences in the flow paths and the difference of the timing of a raindrop from one end to the other. Now that we have our hydroconnectors and break lines defined, we can start in the development of our mesh. As you can see, we have refined mesh cell sizes along our break lines on top of our roadways and along our stream channels and along the berms that parallel the channels. And then we have much bigger cells out in the open flat areas in this particular scenario of these fields. Dams can be a major component associated with your hydraulics and flood risk data development. Most all states have a dam safety program where they manage some level of heights of dams, and they can have a little bit of variations in their definitions of high, medium, and low hazard dams. We've been able to mine a lot of data out of the state agencies associated with the permits of building these dams, which has really helped us identify the intent of the dam and the water body behind it. Was it designed for flood control? And if so, what was the parameters used such that we could incorporate that into our flood risk data sets? It's important in the simulation of those data sets that the mesh cells get represented by a break line associated with the dam. Many times those break lines are extended to high ground and follow high ground such that it'll simulate the emergency spillways and the emergency overflows associated with those dams. Hydroconnectors are used as a method to cut through the embankments of the dam for those dams that you do not want to include associated with flood risk data calculations. Oh boy, you can't miss stream gauges. Stream gauges can be blessings or it can be a curse. If you've got really good data, there's nothing more important. There's not a better treasure chest that you can find than good gauge data associated with a major event. But there's nothing more that'll drive you crazy than questionable gauge data and trying to simulate what's good and what's not good. So stream gauges are very important. They are usually the best available data we have for the major floods of record associated with given locations. And the stream network is growing again, which is a blessing to us in our flood risk data management. This is just a quick reminder that we have updated rainfall statistics over the TP40s that was done in the 60s. On the Missouri graph here, you can see that the increases range from 0 to 1.75 inches in increase for the 24-hour event, which is really significant if you're in that inch to inch and a half range, because that's just stacked on top of your flood depths. This is just a quick refresher. Precipitation, rainfall falls, hydrology determines how much of it runs off, and hydraulics sets how high and how wide it is as it's going down through the conveyance paths through your community and out of your watershed. It's important to recognize that when you're doing this rain on grid calculations that we're doing and hydrology that we're using, it's basically the excess rain that runs off to the mesh cells. HECRAS 6 allows us to truly do spatially varying versus the arithmetic averages that we did in 5.07 or the 5.0 versions of the software. And this has greatly enhanced the flood risk management piece of this and our ability to provide a product that can truly be used for floodplain management. I think it's important to point out again the differences between RAS 5 and RAS 6 associated with distributing rainfall depths across a watershed. RAS 5, you had one rainfall depth, one curve number that you could apply for excess rainfall across the whole watershed, where literally we could calculate a different rainfall depth for each mesh cell associated with RAS 6 if our land use, soils, and curve number calculations were that level of detail. This is a very important part of us being able to use this flood risk data for floodplain management. So to kind of show you how this works, this is not a real event that we use. It's a hypothetical event. It's a simulation of a type 2 type distribution. It sprinkles. It sprinkles a little harder, and then it rains like pouring it out of a bucket, and then it sprinkles again. And that's the event. And you can see the blue line being the total rainfall, the red line being the excess, and the difference between the two being that amount of rainfall that stayed at its landing area or went into the soil, basically just did not leave its area of that it fell into. Sinkholes are an important part of incorporation because they do hold water, and sometimes they overflow, but sometimes they're just a bowl that floods within the volume that gets to it. So basically that concludes hydraulics. Basically you got the slope of the ground, the obstructions, and other things associated with obstructing water flowing from point A to point B. And based on the volume and the timing of the runoff that you had coming out of your hydrology calculations from the mesh cells, you end up with those flood elevations set within the hydraulics. One of the other things I want to point out associated with RAS6 is our ability to put bridges in instead of culverts in, simulating bridges. We have built a model on our 2D modeling for CTPs, simulating bridge openings with box culverts. It didn't make the DOTs very happy, so hopefully they're a little happier with our 2D modeling now that we're able to put bridges in. And this is just a representative opening showing that how we did that and how we were able to put the bridges in with our RAS 6.0. So as we're pulling all these results together, one of the things that you have to start addressing and having a conversation about is how you're going to apply aerial reductions once you get downstream to some very large drainage area sizes, and how you're going to match gauges by doing that to adjust those volumes. Well, one of the things that we found out early on is that if we applied aerial reductions through a standard process, we were way underestimating the flood risk associated in the headwaters from like the 8 square miles up to the 1 square mile drainage areas. We were matching well, we were able to do the adjustments and match well at the gauges, but we were way underestimating in the headwaters. We were trying desperately to keep from having two different models, one for the main large riverine system and then one for the headwaters. So we experimented and ran a lot of sensitivity tests with doing those aerial adjustments on the rising and falling limbs of the hydrograph, and we found that we could still match, we could do those adjustments and match our volumes on the large streams, but we could maintain our risk elevations and risk predictions in the headwaters. So we do a reduction of the volumes and the rising and the falling limbs of the hydrograph as opposed to applying it uniformly across the whole hydrograph. This is a representation of why floodplains are different than model floodplains. As you can see, there's floodplains down every street in this city. The green is a special flood hazard area that was developed based on shorelining along the blue line streams. And I'm going to show you a little bit about our shorelining process. Basically, the green floodplains on the previous map is taking that elevation along that center line conveyance of the NFIP risk source and then just running it flat, running that elevation flat into the topography and setting the special flood hazard area equal to that, as opposed to clipping at a particular depth around the edge of the floodplain. One of the things I want to point out is that with the water surface elevation contours providing in the 2D world, a lot of times they're curved. They're not going to be straight. And as you can see with that cross section drawn from the 1D world, you can be multiple BFE increments higher on one side than the other, as opposed to these contoured water surface elevations that are going to track the water surface elevations within the mesh cells. One of the things that you're going to bring up a lot in the 2D world is people are going to start asking, why are my floodways so wide? There's a lot of reasons for that, but you got to remember that the storage in the floodplains is incorporated in the calculations. One of the sensitivities we ran early is on this watershed where we had a detailed HMS and HECRAS calibrated model. We just dropped in, we also did a 2D excess rain on grid model and calibrated it back to the HMS models for elevation purposes. And then when we took the 1D floodway and put it in the 2D model, we had many places 2, 3, or 4 feet surcharges associated with that 1D floodway. That just points out that our old 1D floodways really did not address the storage reductions associated with those encroachments. This is the beginning of a walkthrough of our floodway development process. We use a process that follows the depth times velocity process. We've done this for approximately 2,000 miles of 2D floodways. We do the depth velocity computations, and we do create our observation lines for across our water surface elevation contours, and then we compute a mean depth velocity for that observation line. We then develop a family of contours for those mean DV contours, and we use those as an estimate for the polygon to compute our floodways. We raise the terrain outside the floodway polygon so that our excess rain on grid flows can enter into the floodway for our floodway computations. This is just a representation of the final floodway, shows the varying surcharges, the bubbles at the confluences from the stream to the left because of the storage associated with that confluence. It should also be noted that many times the discharges in the floodway run rise because of the reduction of the storage. So you kind of get hit from two different aspects, reduction in conveyance as well as increases in discharge, and that alludes to the wider floodways associated with our 2D floodways. So now we're to sharing the flood risk tool because we've got the best data, we've calculated our parameters, we've calibrated, we've verified, and we've created our mapping and rasters, and now we're ready to share. The process we're following, we're developing and delivering the data associated with the Flood Study Review Meeting 1. At that point, we're challenging people to look for missing hydroconnectors, changes in break lines, explaining all of the impacts associated with this in the 2D modeling world, and getting them to see if they can find Waldo, find those areas that were missing, especially pointing out any high water marks associated with any recent floods that we might could use to calibrate or verify to. After the allotted time to provide comments, we pull the comments off the website. We incorporate those and address those and put comment resolution letters and back to the stakeholders. And then we present the data in a Flood Study Review 2 meeting. We walk the stakeholders back through the 2D process, in particular showing them any impacts associated with their comments and changes to their flood risk data sets. There are two important changes since data sets we create here. We try to create a changes from FSR1 to FSR2 so they can see what kind of changes were provided and how their comments and other comments impacted their flood hazard areas. And also we try to show the differences between the effective and the new, in particular, those areas of floodways. Once this data has been rolled out, but it's not on a regulatory path, we need to continue to communicate. We communicate through HECRAS 2D workshops for floodplain management, continued newsletters and fact sheets. We have workshops at state conferences where we have one-on-ones with folks to help them understand their data, use their data, and show them how to change the data. And eventually there's going to be a portal in every state or at the national level to free the data so that everybody has access to this. One of the more important things is to have access to this data for public assistance in the next disasters, which might help you with return on investments at various locations of repeat offenders needing public assistance. One other thing to remember on this flood risk data tool, the tool is the data. The data detail varies by community, but still the results is basically the feeding of the tool. We equal opportunity to have flood risk data to manage toward resilience. Whether it's a small community or a large community, we welcome the flood risk data into the tool. Each community can, at the end of the process, can say they have successfully contributed to the tool. I want to take this time to thank each one of you for participating in this part 2 modeling front porch conversation associated with building a tool for flood risk management. We covered a lot of stuff. We covered through a lot of ideas out there. I'm sure there's some of you that might want to have a front porch conversation about various things. Do not hesitate to reach out to me at stephen.no@woodplc.com, and I would welcome the opportunity to have a continued front porch conversation. Well, welcome aboard to the front porch conversation. Appreciate everybody participating and listening in. I hope you're finding some things informative. Hopefully it's stirring a few questions. Um, as part of that, I want to answer a couple of questions that came in from the part 1 part of the presentation. One being that as we're putting our hydro connectors into our modeling process, we're doing that prior to doing hydrology. So the question came up was, well, how do you know the flows to do your Manning's adjustments? For those Manning adjustments we do to those hydro connectors to simulate those crossings, we're basically doing local regression equation calculations for the given design frequency and using that for those computations. Typically for those pipes, that was probably the same computation that was used to size that pipe. So it's an estimate to simulate. There was another question that came in associated where we're using these to estimate channel erosion and stream stability. Yes, these flood risk data sets are being used for that, and stay tuned if you can for part 3, and you will see that that's a part of that strategy for flood reduction and floodplain management and watershed management that comes out of the flood risk data sets. And most all of the tools that we are using for our flood reduction processes, and we're trying to build those off of the basic flood risk data sets so that if you have a tool that works or you have a process that works, if there has been a flood risk data set developed, then you can apply the process. So therefore, once the process and the tool is defined, it's portable to any community anywhere and adjustable to those watershed characteristics. Looks like questions have kind of slowed down here a little bit as far as the part 2 goes. One of the things that I will throw out there just as added commentary to the previous session that uh, uh, from a modeling standpoint with the RAS6 modeling, uh, the only real issues we're having with RAS6 modeling these days is some of the stability issues in the bridge routines and some volume issues associated with those bridge routines. Um, we're working directly with the folks out in Cal Davis to try to resolve those. Some of those are same issues that happened during the use of unsteady 1D. Uh, and we're hoping that by the time they roll out RAS6 here in a couple, 3 weeks, that at least a couple of those issues may be resolved or at least minimized. So, but actually that issue, and it's not that we can't work through those, it's just a very iterative process to try to track down where those instabilities come from. So, um, but that's really the only issues we're running into with RAS6 moving forward with from our 5.07 models. Got a question here on, has any progress been made to move away from the NRCS type 2? As you know, I prefer Huff's temporal distribution. At this particular point, we have not seen a trend to move away from the type 2 distribution, but I do concur that the type 2 distribution is challenging in a lot of places associated with flood risk, and actually simulating a flood risk that's more representative of an actual event. I've got a question here. Does the model size matter? The model size does matter, and it does matter to the point to where if in the, you know, you need to allow enough efforts to provide room for detail in the future. And the goal is to do that. And we've been tweaking down. We started out in, 200, 250 square mile BLE models a while back, a long time ago. We're down now to probably 50 to 100 square mile models. So, and from a living model standpoint, that's a growing thing, but it hasn't become to a reality yet in too many locations. And I'm getting the note here that we need to wrap up this so that we can move on to part 3. Keep the questions coming. As you know, I've sent my email address out there. If there's any other questions or front porch conversations you want to have, do not hesitate to reach out to me. I'm always anxious to have further discussions with folks about this flood risk management process. And with that, we'll wrap it up so we can get on to part 3. Welcome to the Woods Showcase presentations. Typically, these are for highlighting the next fancy this or that within the industry. Today, I want to take a different path and have a good old front porch conversation. The showcase is divided into 3 presentations, which are all centered around building a flood risk tool. Now, whoa, Nelly, don't head off in the wrong direction. The tool I'm talking about is the collective sets of flood risk data, both regulatory and non-regulatory, that individuals and communities could, should, and will have access to in the near future to manage their flood risk. Earlier, we had a great front porch conversation about data and parameter development, followed by a front porch conversation about modeling. And now we are in building a tool for flood risk management, part 3, regulatory and flood reduction. Our flood risk tool has kind of come to a crossroads. Regulatory path or not regulatory path. So first, let's head down the non-regulatory path and summarize it. One of the things I want you to think about as we head down the non-regulatory path is that all of these things can be done and accomplished without traveling down the regulatory roadway. This flood risk data is your best available flood risk information. You might have a digital flood insurance rate maps. You might have a DFIRM database. It might actually be created on 10-meter DIMS. Everything you have might be model based. But this truly would be your best available data. One of the things this is going to have that your other data didn't is this is going to point out those pluvial water surface elevations. I'm sure within many communities, you've had areas that flooded that aren't in the special flood hazard area and had those difficult conversations with folks about why did they flood if they weren't in the special flood hazard area. You could also use this data to assess flood reduction alternatives easily. You could use this to do policy scenario changes, on-site detention, green infrastructure, climate change and rainfall amounts. You might take a historical event and change the way it crosses the community. It goes across this community instead of this community to see what would happen if City A had the same event that City B had the year before. So this is best available data and should be used accordingly. As we start down this discussion about a profile analysis, What this analysis is it provides the information to planners and engineers to where you can look at it and the data helps you make the decisions quickly. The first piece of that data that will help you make that decision is a smart footprints database. At a minimum in that database, you need the highest adjacent grade and the lowest adjacent grade that touches that structure. The lowest adjacent grade basically would be if the water started coming up, what's the first point on that structure that the water would touch. The highest adjacent grade would be the last point on that structure that the water would touch. You might be able to mine building foundation type out of the data that the city may have access to. That's important because you know that if it's slab on grade, then the lowest adjacent grade is probably going to be a good flood elevation. Where if it's built on block system with a raised floor, then highest adjacent grade might be a better than a lowest adjacent grade. You need to be able to flag all the water service elevations for the events that we've done flood risk data calculations on for that structure. So what's the elevation for the 10-year, the 25, the 50, the 100, the 100 plus, 500 year, whatever elevations that you have, attach those to each of those footprints. Now the last but not least thing you need to have in that database is what is the stationing of the flooding source that's associated with that water service elevation. That's important because if you take a tick mark for the lowest adjacent grade for that structure and you put it in the profile, then you want it to be at the right elevation in the profile when you're doing your flood window computations. In developing your profiles, many of the different industry leaders out have their own versions of this, but in developing that profile, you basically want to do a walk along the invert of the stream from downstream to upstream, looking for those areas that have flooded structures either side, and then you divide those out into kind of flood reaches. And I typically like to divide those out into areas where you have riverine reaches where the water surface elevations are pretty much tracking the stream inverts, because truthfully in those reaches the only way you're going to reduce flooding is either through stream conveyance improvement or with upstream detention by reducing the flows that you're trying to push through that reach. And then the other reaches would be those areas where you have obstructions that show kind of like a backwater condition, a roadway crossing where it backs up and overtops, other pinch points, development that's pinched out into the floodplain enough to cause a drop in water surface elevations of feet over a short period of time of the reach. These particular locations can be viable flood reduction alternatives by increasing the conveyance through those openings. And roadway crossings are an easy check and an easy opening because you can easily maybe pick up that maybe there needs to be 2 10 by 10 boxes instead of 1 10 by 10 box, and you eliminated flooding in 8 of the 10 houses. So what you do with those profiles is you develop flood windows, as I call them. You look at the depth of reduction needed to eliminate flooding in about 80% of the impacted footprints. So you take the elevation at the one at the highest in the profile, and you take the elevation of the one at the lowest in the profile, and you might figure out that you need to reduce the water surface elevation 3.5 feet in order to get all of those structures out of that backwater profile. Then you also look at those as what it would take to take 100% of the impacted footprints out. And then after you've assessed those for these reaches, one of the things that typically falls out of this is any of those elevations and those lowest adjacent grades, if that's what you're using for your analysis, if any of those grades are below the 50 or 25-year event, typically those need to be pulled out and put into the buyout category, because typically you cannot afford to implement a flood reduction alternative to eliminate the flooding for those structures. So then you go back through and look at what is the windows without the buyout footprints, and that becomes your true window that you probably move forward with determining what kind of flood reduction alternatives would be applicable to each of the given reaches. So once you have those reaches developed, one of the things you're looking for is what kind of improvements can I do to achieve that reduction of those flood window requirements. Transportation crossings are pretty easy because you're just looking to increase the conveyance through. Sometimes it's lowering an invert if there's a head cut in the area that you can take advantage of. Channel improvements, either by widening the channel, reducing the friction by improving the bank flows within the channel, building floodplain benches at a certain level, maybe starting at the 10-year water surface elevations. And all of those typical cuts are easy to do because you can just modify the terrain in your 2D model, adjust your mesh, and rerun the alternatives to see if you can achieve those windows. You can also run those in series to see if they are non-independent in order to achieve those goals. In a bigger picture, depending on which upstream of your areas of flooding, you can also do tracing upstream to figure out where the water's coming from is actually contributing to the flooding. Once you do that up all of the different tributaries upstream, you can start to map out those areas beyond that contributing area to where you could actually look for and see if there's a viable detention location to reduce the flooding for that particular point of interest. And that's a very special problem and a very special set of data that's provided to us in our 2D modeling, is to look for those viable detention locations upstream to reduce the flooding at any given point of interest downstream. Detention assessment and detention finding in an urban environment is tough at times, but just don't write it off just because you need it in an urban area. A lot of times there might be little areas that you can put in some viable detention that can provide a significant flood reduction downstream. Typically, the real impact areas were going to be upstream in more undeveloped rural areas. One of the most popular things that I've seen lately is where you have a majority of a city or a majority of a small town developed on one side of a stream, and as you move up the corridor on the watershed, there's a major thoroughfare on one side kind of tracking parallel to the direction of the watershed. So there's some development scattered along there between the stream and the thoroughfare, but when you look to the other side of the stream, it's really fairly rural, or might be fairly rural in agriculture. So following the process we talked about on the previous page, looking for those areas upstream that have runoff that's actually contributing to the peaks of the flooding downstream, you start looking in those areas, you might find a good rural open area that would have a natural pinch point that could provide a lot of flood reduction for a minimal amount of cost. You might also do some coordination with NRCS and some other agencies, Fish and Wildlife, to see if there's any areas in that part of the world, in that part of the watershed, to where there might be a need for recreational or irrigation waters. You start looking at those different things and coming up with multiple partners. Next thing you know, you might have a viable location for a regional detention or facility that provides flood control, provides recreation, and or provides irrigation for the agricultural community. Another thing that the 2D models provide us is lots of data associated with velocity and stream power, and we were able to take this data through some GIS tools, and you can actually do a vector-based prediction of where you ought to have setbacks and where you may or may not should build. This particular location is already having stream movement and issues in the backs of these houses, and this prediction model is actually predicting in the same locations as the areas that are having those problems. And basically you might use this to set your setbacks and or to have those areas to where engineers have to have an engineered solution to prevent that movement toward that particular area prior to building. One of the things we're doing in a couple of locations is we're building these alternative analysis as part of our risk on command type projects. And so we're not only showing up with our communities with problems, we're showing up to them with viable alternatives. And to get to a viable alternative, you got to pick your best of the 80% and or 100% flood reduction alternatives, excluding the buyout options, and propose those to the local stakeholders. I'm not telling y'all anything you don't already know, but there's lots of other tangibles that need to be identified and assessed associated with flood reduction alternatives. Are there critical facilities in the neighborhood? Lifelines? What kind of funding sources would you have for the various alternatives in the locations? Is there community support? Does the community see it as a need? Do they see it as a desire? And are they willing to get behind and support something? What kind of impacts does it have on resilience? Does one of your major factories flood every time that the flooding occurs? And doing that, how long does it take for the factory to get back up and running so that paychecks are flowing through your local economy? All of these things that we've been talking about can be accomplished without traveling down the regulatory path using this best available data. Well, we've come full circle. We went down the non-regulatory path and looked at a lot of things that you can do down the non-regulatory path with the updated flood risk data. Now let's try to head down the regulatory path. Now, I'm going to give you fair warning. This is not as clear cut as the non-regulatory path. We may need a tow truck to get us out of the ditch, or we may have to build a new road just to get from point A to point B because the old road just won't travel that way anymore. One of the main differences with regulatory versus non-regulatory is you are changing that legal regulatory map. You're changing the impacts associated with required flood insurance. This representation here at first glance would appear to have more green than red on it, which means there's more area within this reach of the stream coming out of the special flood hazard area than there is going in. But the area is sometimes not the most significant. You probably need to turn the footprints on to determine how many actual structures are being impacted and how many businesses are being impacted. You know, lots of times there's new extents too, where you'll have new floodplains created that have never been. One of the things that going down the regulatory path versus the non-regulatory path is really important to the local enforcement folks is that they may not have the support politically to enforce the best available data. But if they can get the flood risk data pushed through the regulatory process, then they're required by the NFIP program to enforce it, and they have that regulatory support. So that could be key factor in terms of who would want and who would not really mind getting the regulatory products. Okay, here we go. As I said, we may need a tow truck to get us out of the ditch, or we might need to just build a new road to get from one place to another to travel new ground. It's not a square hole into a round hole or a round hole into a square hole, but it is pretty close to an octagon peg into a round hole. There are some rough edges around the edge that we're going to have to work through and shave off in order to take 2D flood risk into a 1D regulatory framework. There are a lot of things out there that are open for discussion. Our shoreline special flood hazards areas versus clipped at a certain depth. We believe that the shoreline method meets the intent of the 1D regulatory special flood hazard areas as best it can from a 2D world. As we've talked about the Dennis the Menace water in our 2D models flowing every which way, taking shortcuts from point A to point B, whether it's in a rural setting or a urban setting, we see a lot of additional conveyance paths from one point to another that we would never have recognized in the 1D world. Many times these conveyance paths end up providing a split floodway. Do we need profiles for all of the defined conveyance paths? I believe we do. But defining what conveyance paths actually require that, there's a lot of different debate out there. Creating observation lines, water surface elevation contours. I believe that we need to treat those as cross sections. We calculate velocities, flow areas, surcharges, and other floodway data table values that go in the FIS along those observation lines. One of the reasons I really would like to be able to do that is it provides us the ability to have mapped and unmapped observation lines, which I think will really roll into the AMP process well. We need to do some expansions in our FIS tables to expand them to provide regulatory compliance tolerances. For a given location of a given observation line, what is the tolerance across there on averaging to get your surcharge or get your water surface elevation? We need enough detail in the FIS tables so that we can have repeatability so that the regulatory enforcement down the road with LOMARs can function. One thing for sure you can say about 2D mesh modeling, it does clearly highlight the value of storage within the floodplain. All of our stream gauge analysis takes into account the storage of the floodplain, but most of our 1D modeling in the past may or may not have simulated some of the storage, but in no way did it use the storage like our mesh cells do. Maybe we should be encouraging compensating cut and fill for all frequencies within the floodplain. It is important, the volume of the bathtub. When we're modeling 3D footprints in the terrain within our models to simulate that volume loss as well as to divert the flow. One of the issues we've had with a lot of our rural and or urbanized areas is when you've got those streets parallel to the stream and you got water that pops out at a roadway and then it runs down a parallel street to the next roadway and then goes back into the channel. Without those footprints in the terrain, sometimes those flows down the roadways are hard to simulate in our mesh environment. We have the ability to do stream erosion and stability predictions, and probably shame on us if we don't. The variations between the discharges of a special flood hazard model and a floodway model, because when you are encroaching in on that storage, depending on how much you encroach, you're taking storage away, which increases the discharges. Now, have I listed everything of the decisions we're looking for? Nope. This is only a few of the decisions that we've got to face as we go down the regulatory path of our 2D modeling world. Whether you realize it or not, we're kind of in a paradigm shift in the flood risk tool development. Change will always occur and usually produces better circumstances. So, each of us needs to do our part as flood risk tool developers and the users to provide communities the tool to be more flood resilient. Because remember, we are building tomorrow's tool today for the most strategic return on investment. It's important for us to build our tools and our regulatory environment to adjust to the changes that are coming, not only on the paper side of the regulatory side, but also in the changing environment and the changing computational side of flood risk. I want to thank you for participating in this front porch conversation, part 3, associated with regulatory and flood reduction. I want to thank this time that we've had these front porch conversations, including the previous 2 today as part of the showcase. I'm sure that, especially with this part of the regulatory piece, there was some thoughts provoked amongst the front porch attendees. If you want to discuss any of those and have a front porch conversation, don't hesitate to reach out to me at steven.no@woodplc.com, and I'll look forward to having those front porch conversations as we try to navigate through the regulatory community. Well, we made it through the front porch conversation. We've got our RC cola and our moon pie, and we've had a successful walk through all 3 parts. As part of the question answer session associated with part 3 here, I want to expand a little bit on another part of the part 2 question. These models that we're working on these days and moving forward with, they are eventually going to become living models, these 2D models, because you're going to actually have to use them to show and determine your impacts within watersheds. The industry's not ready for that yet, but I could see that transitioning over the next 5 years to where these models may be in the cloud, and a given developer or given landowner wanting to change something goes in, can pick changes, submit it, and it comes back and tells them what the potential impacts, positive or negative, that their changes might have on the flood risk on site, as well as your upstream and downstream neighbors. We're not far from that happening. It's going to be a slow change. It probably will not happen within my career, but several of the young guns that's leading the industry will clearly lead the industry into that. So just want to throw that out there as a last part of the front porch conversation this morning. The other thing I wanted to throw out is that industry folks and industry leaders and people within the industry, CTPs, FEMA folks, FEMA project officers and stuff, everybody needs to dedicate a certain amount of their energy and time to how to use these flood risk data tools and these flood risk data sets to help communities manage floodplains better and do floodplain management better, and make it accessible. Let's continue to grow portals to make the data available, because if you haven't seen it, you will see it before too long. If you stay in this industry, people light up when they get access to the data. One of the themes that's moving around through the industry is free the data up. Let the smarts of the data be available to all, so that they can educate themselves and respect the risk. So, and I thank everybody for their time this morning, walking through these front porch conversations. Hopefully, parts of it you found out to be informative and very useful. And as I've said a couple of times earlier already, my email address is in the presentation, steven.no@woodplc.com. I'm always open for another front porch conversation about any of these topics, and look forward to those. Looking down at the questions, I don't see any additional questions coming forward. And we'll give everybody another minute or 2 here if there is an additional question. And if not, we'll give everybody a few minutes of their time back this morning. And again, just want to thank you for participating in the Wood Showcase here, front porch conversation across the flood development of a flood risk management tool. So not seeing any other questions. Thank y'all. Stay safe. Have an enjoyable rest of the time here with ASFPM, and we'll see you soon in person, hopefully. Thank you.